welcome to our fourth. So welcome to our fourth installment of our Connect Inspire Share talks. Today we have a very important and relevant talking to all of us working in the field of academic language and learning, which is supporting neurodiverse students. We have, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the custodianship of the law of the country on which we stand. I'm currently in Wallumedegal land in Darug Nation in New South Wales, and I want to pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for our country. So we have a team of panelists. I have here an overview, but I will present each set of panelists as we go forward. And without much further ado, because it's a busy schedule, I'm going to introduce Matt Harrison and Jess O'Riordan. They are both working at the University of Melbourne leading a neurodiversity project, and they are here to present their overview and findings. So I'm gonna pass it on to Matt and Jess.
It's going to be just me today.
Oh, okay.
Hate to disappoint, but I will just share my screen.
We thought, just based on Steve's advice from the past about presenting, it's better to have one voice rather than us trying to cut in and out. So, Jess.
Hi, Matt. You're here now.
Hello. Yes.
Hi. All right. So thank you so much for inviting us to talk today and share about the University of Melbourne Neurodiversity Project. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a really brief rundown about who we are and what we do. But I mainly want to share about some of our preliminary findings from our recent student needs analysis. And these are some findings related to teaching and learning. And I'm going to give 3 important takeaways at the end related to teaching and learning. So getting into it, this is what we are all about. Our overarching mission is to empower our community and help the University of Melbourne become a global leader in neurodiversity inclusive research and practice. Now, we also believe that this should be done with neurodivergent-led teams, nothing about us without us. So we have a fully neurodivergent team. I'm Dr. Jessica Reardon, but I also co-lead this project with Dr. Sarah Timperley and Dr. Matthew Harrison. And we have, and a cat. Away she goes. And we have 4 main aims. We want to build a stronger sense of community for our neurodivergent staff and students. And we're doing this through putting things like community stories up on our website, and we're going to be running some social groups. But we also want to help improve the understanding of neurodivergence at the University of Melbourne. And to do that, we've been really focusing in on our professional development workshops around the university. We are also connecting neurodivergent staff and students with support services that the university already run. And we also conduct neurodiversity affirming research. And part of that is what I'm going to share today, which are some preliminary results from our needs analysis. Now, there we go. So, in this needs analysis, we had 539 students answer a very extensive survey where we asked about their experiences with academics, first year, social life, their first year experiences, what barriers, facilitators. And we really wanted to get a good idea, a snapshot of how our neurodivergent students are faring. Now, most of our students were in their 20s, but we did have a wide range. Most of our students identified as women, but I don't think it has anything to do with neurodivergence there. We know from academic research that women are just really good at filling out surveys. We had 50-50 split almost for undergrads and postgrads. We had students from every single faculty, but what we really wanted to highlight was the disclosure stats. So if you see here that 65% of our undergrads and only 63% of our postgrads have disclosed that they are neurodivergent. Now, you might think that this is pretty good, but this question was disclosed to anyone. So this could just be one student, one faculty member, not necessarily to the university. And I'm going to circle back to this later on in this talk about why this might be. Now, when it comes to neurotypes, most of our students identified as ADHDers, but we did also have a large proportion of students identify as being autistic. But then our next groups was OCD and acquired neurodiversity. Now, acquired neurodiversity can be things like head injuries, but with our sample, it was mostly trauma-based, so CPTSD, where trauma can rewire the brain and change how people see the world. And only half of our students identified with just one condition, so there was a lot of intersectionality here. We had lots identify with 2 conditions or 3. So it's really important to know that when you're working with students, firstly, they may not disclose that they're neurodivergent. And secondly, everyone's neurotype is different and we all have different support needs. Because what's really, really great and what we know is that these students are motivated to study. They want to be here. They really enjoy university. They want to do well. But they say that their marks do not necessarily reflect their ability and they don't reflect their effort. Now, there's so many reasons for this. And when I asked them to expand, I could do a whole talk on this. But this student really summed it up nicely. As a neurodivergent student, it can be quite discouraging when you put in a large amount of effort which is not reflected in grades. This is because expectations are not accessibly conveyed to students, and asking academic staff for help is discouraged. This leaves me feeling overwhelmed and confused as to how I can succeed. And again, diving a little bit further into it in our open-ended questions, one of the biggest themes that came across time and time again were that assessments were above and beyond the worst part of their courses. And a lot of the time, this was about inaccessible assessment guidelines because there were a lack of clear rubrics and guidelines, so they found it hard to understand the assignments. But also examination conditions as well. So they got really frustrated if they did well during the year, but then they did poorly on exams because they can't read out the questions out loud to themselves, or it's slow to edit their responses, or they have sensory issues that they just can't tune out. So what could be some of the solutions? You would think that, accommodations, this is the way forward, or just talking to the academic staff members about some clarity. What is it that they want in these assessments? But this student summed it up nicely. Half of the staff straight up refused to answer direct questions about what is and what isn't a hurdle requirement. And so when they do reach out to academic staff members, they're not getting the answers they need. So what could be the solution? Maybe formal adjustment plans? Maybe, that could help. They could say, look, I have these needs. Can you please help? But of our sample, only 40% of our students had a current academic adjustment plan. And there are many reasons for this, which I'll go into a little bit later. But do accommodations work? What did these students say? Well, yes, accommodations are really helpful. The accommodations on their plan help them to achieve better marks and to reduce their stress levels. But we know that not many of our students have these plans and that when they directly go to staff members, they're not getting help. So how can we help students access accommodations? When we asked them to expand on why they don't have an adjustment plan, the most common replies were, I didn't even know they were an option. The process is far too difficult. I haven't got the time or the cognitive energy to navigate it. A big one that came through was also about the diagnostic process. I'm not sure about some of your universities, but our university, it needs to be a recent diagnosis. If you were diagnosed as a child, you have to get reassessed. And we know that, the diagnostic process can be in the thousands and the wait list can be over a year. And so the students, by the time they get one, it's too late. But students also said that the accommodations don't meet their needs. And then these last ones, which link back to the disclosure issue. They don't want to disclose to the university that they're neurodivergent. And at the moment, they have to disclose to get an official accommodation plan. And a lot of times, this ties back to their identity and not wanting to feel like a failure. And unfortunately, this really ties into the current culture that we have around neurodiversity and the understanding that we have around it. Because, again, this could be in a whole nother talk about why people don't want to disclose. But just to finish off, I wanted to share some of the discrimination results so you can kind of get an idea of what this could be the problem. So 64% of students reported hearing insensitive and disparaging remarks about neurodivergent people from other students, and 18% of our students said they heard these frequently. 49% of our students reported even hearing these from academic staff members. And again, 13% of our students said that they hear these remarks frequently. And unfortunately, 40% reported that they hear these remarks directed at them. So they're experiencing direct discrimination because of their neurotype. So it's really, you can really understand why there's a big issue with disclosure and why people don't want to come forward and ask for help. So we really need to just reassess how we're teaching and how we're assessing learning to try and make these more accessible for neurodivergent learners. We really need to be making our academic adjustment plans more accessible. And we also need to take a really good hard look at the culture of inclusion. I know this was about the University of Melbourne, but I know from other students and other staff members, this isn't an Australia-wide problem, or this is a worldwide problem. And part of the solution is we really need to be educating ourselves, other people, just getting this wide wraparound service to everyone understand neurodiversity, how it presents, and why inclusive practice matters. Because until we do this, our students, our neurodivergent students who want to be here, who are motivated to learn, they're not going to do well. And they are going to continue to drop out and be lonely and isolated and, yeah, just not have a good time. So I think the other people who are going to share today are going to expand on these, which is going to be really great. But that is us. Here is our links. We have a mailing list to keep being updated about what we do. We have a website, which we are still constructing, but feel free to email us if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jess. That was really inspiring in a way and discouraging in another, seeing the widespread discrimination. So we're going to continue to see if we can have some time for questions at the end. So I'm going to introduce the next speaker, which is Tajana Blažević. She's a learning advisor and disability project officer at the University of Adelaide. So I'm gonna give the room to Tajana.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got some slides as well. I didn't say I was going to have slides yesterday, and then I decided I needed the slides. So typical neurodivergent things. Okay. All right. Can everyone see that? Because it's saying it's paused for me. Yep. Okay, cool. So the Neurodiversity Project and Neurodivergent Study Skill Workshops. So I'm an academic learning advisor 1 day a week on a casual basis at the Writing Centre, but 4 days a week I am the Disability Support Project Officer. This is a fairly new position, and I am the only person right now who's working on the Neurodiversity Project. Can we see that next slide about project names?
It's for me at least, it's not in presentation view, Tiana.
Okay. Problem here. Okay, let's go. There we go. 2 seconds. Can we see this?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, I'm just going to stay on this one. So the project aims. One of the main outcomes of this project is to create a peer mentoring program for neurodiverse students. The pilot will launch next year in semester 1 of 2025, and I've currently received close to 30 expression of interest for students. It's to create additional resources for both staff and students related to neurodivergent learning, to develop and run workshops such as the study skill workshops that I'm going to talk to you about today, to raise further awareness of neurodivergent conditions and how it impacts students as well as staff. I've done some collaborations with HR, and also connecting with students on their experience as a neurodivergent person through the creation of a neurodivergent student committee, as well as a university-wide survey that I'm currently collecting responses on. Okay. So the study skill workshops, these workshops are taught from a neuroaffirming and strength-based approach. The workshops are part of the Neurodiversity Project, and they're currently funded through this project work and hosted by the Writing Centre at the University of Adelaide. The workshop activities incorporate critical reflection practices for students, and each workshop will discuss practical study strategies that neurodivergent students can incorporate. I've designed the workshops with HDR students in mind as well, and I touch on that where I can because we do have some HDR students that come to these workshops. The workshops will have either one or several reflection worksheet activities for the students to complete there in person, and I create all of these worksheet templates and activities using Canva. So here are some of the sessions so far. Now, this is a complete pilot. We only started doing this in semester 2 because I started my role in April of this year. So there are 12 sessions in total. They run on a weekly basis. We're currently up to understanding and managing executive functions. So we're trying to hit on every type of academic core skill, but also looking at well-being as well, stress management, self-care, how to create a really good study environment for a neurodiverse student. The workshops are right now only held in person on a Tuesday from 10 to 11:30. There's a max of 35 students per session, and we've averaged around 21 students per week, which I think is really good numbers. The workshops are not held online, but I'm looking at expanding them next year and potentially running 2 different days as well, because we know that students, always can't come in person, and it's really important for me to make these as equitable as possible. But right now it's just me doing all of this. So holding them in person, though, has created a sense of community, I've found, with these students. They're filling out a survey after every single session to tell me what they enjoyed, what they didn't enjoy, how it can be improved, and how I can implement that into the next session. And many of them have said that they've really enjoyed working with other students because they don't feel as isolated anymore. And as Jess just said in her presentation, we know that students are feeling quite isolated when they're neurodivergent. So how I make sure the workshops are neuro-friendly, there's no judgment for being late, and I communicate that as much as I can to students. There's no requirements to participate in the group, so there's always an online option available. They're encouraged to get up and walk around, and if they need to have stims close to them, that's completely fine. I'll leave paper on the table for anyone who wants to draw or doodle to maintain their focus. At the start of the session, I always ask how the lighting is in the room, because we can control the lighting in that room, and we'll all decide collaboratively how many lights we want on or off for that day based on how we're all feeling. I know that I'm really light sensitive. The slides are always different. They incorporate UDL colors such as pastels, but I also try to have some sensory stimulation in their design. So I do really think quite harder about how the slides should be designed for each week. And through the booking system that students use to book into the workshops, which is Calendly, students are also asked a variety of questions on the types of learning strategies that they like, if they have any accessibility issues, what they're needing from the workshop materials. Do they need captions? Do they need it prior to coming to the workshop? And I check this regularly on a daily basis. The text reminder for the workshops also has really specific information on wayfinding, because that was something that students said, I really need to make sure I know where I'm going. And these workshops are held in a space that is not always the easiest to find. So I make sure the text reminders are sent out 24 and 4 hours beforehand. The approach of the workshops will build on one another by first establishing the foundations around understanding neurodivergency, sensory needs, discovering more from both a research-based approach and a generalist approach. I am neurodivergent myself, so that content is created with lived experiences in mind, as well as my knowledge from working with students in one-on-one consultations since 2020. I incorporate research-based journals and evidence, but I also consult a lot of generalist and general readings. I found that these sources contain much better practical strategies on neurodivergency and how to manage day-to-day activities. TikTok is also a really great source of information, and my students talk about it quite regularly and exchange tips that they've found online. We know that the neurodiversity movement did come from an online cohort first. And the workshops also, as I say, contain a variety of worksheets, but we also do lots of activities. We do group tasks. But as I say, if there's any students that don't feel comfortable with group tasks, there's always an online option, which is Slido, so that they can still put their discussion or their input on the screen so that they can still participate and they don't feel awkward while they're in those sessions. And as I said, they do cover a lot of academic skills, but from that neurodivergent perspective. The workshops also discuss some of the ways that neurodivergent students are sometimes boxed into neurotypical study routines and ideas about best academic practice. I like to flip a lot of things on their head and really talk about things from more of a social perspective sometimes. For example, the workshop on time management steps out of what I call that deficit model and the idea that neurodivergent students can, sort of just buy a planner and they'll be able to manage their time really effectively. I think telling neurodivergent students on a session or giving them any advice around time management and organization that they can just schedule and prioritize when they have more of an interest-based approach and an interest-based nervous system is essentially like telling them to nail, jelly to a tree. It's not going to work for them. So you do need to be creative with your solutions. And instead, we sort of discussed peak productivity, so the hours of the day that work best for them, how long, how to work with fatigue levels, and also that interest-based nervous system. And like I said, I like to incorporate a lot of social ideas and social research on neurodivergent conditions rather than a biomedical approach, because I try to situate all of these study skills within their social and cultural context. For example, when we talked about reading comprehension, there's this assumption that if you're autistic, you don't know how to comprehend or make meaning out of text, which is just factually incorrect. And we know that that's wrong. So trying to, again, flip all of this and make sure that students know that everything they're learning is often based in a social and cultural context. In every workshop, I try and give them as many tools as I can, and I really stress to them to just implement what they can when they can. I don't try to throw everything at them, and I really stress it's about finding what tools work for them and how much you can tolerate as well. And this is all a discovery process. So my discovery process and the discovery process, this is my sort of pedagogy when I work with students and create these workshops, is that most students are not asked to reflect on their academic practices. It's why I do the reflection worksheets. And I think that creating these worksheets, again, gets them to really think about what works best for me and my learning. And I think there are also many assumptions about neurodivergent learners. They often do come from, really bad high school experiences and primary school experiences. I know that I experienced that myself when I was only diagnosed with dyslexia. And it's really important because of that to approach them holistically. And what I mean by holistically is that if a neurodivergent student is asking you, how do I manage my time better? My first question isn't, okay, so what are we doing? And do we break this down into little tasks? My first question is actually, how are you sleeping? What's your well-being like? What's the nutrition like? If we feel comfortable and I've built, a relationship with that student and they are someone that menstruates, we'll talk about menstrual cycles, because more and more research is coming out around women specifically and ADHD and how they're coping with their menstrual cycles. And it's also really important to take into consideration that neurodivergent students are likely to have way more health conditions. So they're more likely to have PCOS, PMD, hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, restless leg syndrome, fatigue, and a whole host of other health conditions. And that's really important, I think, to consider that, because we know that all of those things, your general well-being, your health, your sleep, does feed into your academic skills and also how you're feeling about study. And there's lots of layers here that I think need to be taken into consideration when we think about neurodivergent students and how to create systems that work for them. Here is my email address. I also have a website that I'll post in the chat as well, and I'm always happy to talk about the project and some of the other support systems that I'm creating too. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I think that made us think about a lot of things, and my first impression is that all those suggestions would really apply to the general population and would work better for them. So we move on to the next speaker, and she's Kathy French. She's the past program manager at the University of Tasmania.
Hello. I too will just pop my slides up for sharing. There we go. So yes, I am the past program coordinator here at the University of Tasmania, and I've also held learning advisor appointments here as well. Prior to this, I worked in student support at Charles Sturt University, having transitioned over from the teaching research side of things there. And I'm originally from Queensland, where I did my Bachelor of Science and my PhD at the University of Queensland. So with one-on-one appointments, I'll just will share my general approach, and then I will follow through and share a little framework that I have for appointment. So most of the time I will I will refer to strategies and techniques and things like that as tools in your toolbox. And this is, and the way that I approach this is to assume that people develop tools through their life experiences, through their education, and through their natural strengths in their social and cultural context. And that each person will have different tools in their toolbox. And we can always improve, update, or develop new tools. I approach my student work from a strengths perspective. And generally speaking, I'm not really concerned with whether they have a diagnosis or what it is. What I want to know is I want to know about them. So I want to know what they've managed so far, what's easy for them, what their current tools are for dealing with challenges. And I really like to focus on their strengths as those sorts of useful tools that they can use to tackle their challenges. So it's about supporting them to develop these strengths further, and perhaps to consider developing some new tools as well. I tend to use neutral language, and I will frame the challenges in terms of a skill or a tool or a resource that the student currently does not have. And I'm trying to avoid the perspective or the implication that not having this, not being able to meet this challenge is somehow a failing or a deficit. It just means that the student hasn't yet developed the tools that are going to be able to deal with the current issue. And this also applies when a student may have tried different strategies and not had success. And so the approach I'm taking is that, look, that tool just wasn't the right tool for that situation. It's not suitable for the task, so let's put it back in the toolbox and let's pull out another one. I think it's important to always be mindful of de-escalating the students, or to really give them space to have time to regulate their emotions, especially if they're talking about challenges, and that really will start to heighten their emotions. And I appreciate that the emotional regulation that they're trying to achieve in the appointment with me is taking a lot of their cognitive effort. So I don't want to put further demand on that. And some of the ways that I assist them with their emotional regulation is to make sure that I remain calm. I will always like to use active listening strategies because I do like to always be checking my understanding of what they've said. It's important to me to really accept what they're telling me about their experience without questioning any of their reaction to it or any of their emotions to it, to give them the space and the dignity of believing their experience. I've often noticed actually that when students start to become more rigid or more resistant to the conversation that we're having, it's usually because they actually are starting to feel threatened or vulnerable. And as a consequence, they're having like a bit of the flight or fight reaction where, their bodyguard's coming out and is trying to protect them from an unpleasant experience, which they will probably have had quite a few times across their life. So it's for them, this is a reasonable reaction to be having, because it is a repeating pattern for them in their life. So when I start to see that they're having this rigid, resistant reaction, I will backpedal. I will, okay, lower my voice. We are going to be calm, and I want you to tell me why this is a no, because I believe you, and this is a no, and I won't push. Things like that, because I know that until the student feels safe to consider change, to consider options, I'm not going to make progress. And if the issue that we've touched on is actually heightening a student a lot, this is where I would also want to be referring to counsellors or to other support services. And I might also be looking at some other ways to make sure that the environment we're currently in while the student's processing their emotions is more supportive. So maybe maybe I might turn the lights off. Maybe I might find, just probably need to keep moving on. Sorry. The next point is reality checks. And what I want to talk about here is with a lot of neurodivergent people, you can ask us, can you do that? And we will just think about the specific task and go, yes, I can do that. We don't think about the context in which that task is happening, and we don't consider our capacity across any time period. And so once we are getting towards the types of strategies a student or tools the students might like to try, I want to start bringing in the well, okay, we think this might be a possible avenue to go down. How is it going to fit with your other responsibilities in life? How is it going to fit with your usual routine? How is it going to fit with your cognitive capacity? Because if it doesn't fit with all of those things, it's not a solution. It's just got to go back in the toolbox and we've got to try something else. I have a couple of suggestions around what supports sustainability when somebody is trying to go through creating change in their habits or their routines. And these are pretty well established within the literature as well. So habit stacking, pack your new task onto something you do routinely. So for example, I always forget medication in the morning. So medication is stacked onto first cup of coffee. If I have coffee, I must have tablets. It's just the way it goes. Things like an accountability buddy, either finding someone who will work alongside you or someone who you can tell I'm going to do these tasks in the next 2 days, and they will actually check in with you and ask, how are you going with those tasks? Nesting for success essentially means identifying the environment in which you are most productive and you feel most comfortable and successful. So if that means you're studying in bed with the lights off, with your noise cancelling headphones on, with the door locked and your water bottle, then you do that. That is what is successful for you. So you go make your nest with all your supports and you do it. And the final one is to also touch on sensory support. I think this is probably a very underexplored area for a lot of high masking neurodivergent people. And the relief and the cognitive capacity that can be offered by a sensory support like loop earbuds to cut down some of the noise, or turning off the fluoros because they are quite an unpleasant experience. Making sure you only have your safe foods, whatever it is that creates a sensory environment that is less demanding on your system. Start trying to accommodate and bring those things into your life. And the last tool in my toolbox is always adaptability. I'm always coming from the perspective of understanding somebody else's experience and understanding how we might be able to co-create or work together with their strengths, their capacities, and their goals to create a strategy and some tools that will support them in that process. Okay, so I did say I had a framework for appointments. I have a framework because I'm neurodivergent. I love frameworks. It gives me a starting point, a goal, and steps along the way. And I would recommend that frameworks for a lot of neurodivergent people, because knowing where you're starting, knowing where you're going, and some signposts along the way takes a lot of cognitive strain away. And the other reason I have a framework is because without clear signposts, I will go on side quests and we will have a long tangential discussion about something not really relevant right now. Okay, so my framework, I start with explore. And that's to really get to know the student better, to explore how they're experiencing their studies, where their challenges are, where their successes are, and very crucially, what they want to achieve out of their study. Once we get through this phase and I'm starting to hear, okay, these are the good bits, these are the challenges, you really want to work on, this thing specifically, like understanding rubrics. That's when I move into the focus phase, and I will reflect back to them or summarize back to them what I think they've said, just to make sure we are on the same page. And then we really move quickly into the planning stage. And in this stage, this is where I'm really co-creating with the student what approach they would like to take, what supports they might need, and what resources I might be able to offer them. And it is very much about working with the student as to what will they be able to implement independently. That's not going to rely on me or rely on somebody else. I'm going to work within their systems, their strengths, and the way that they approach their studies to achieve the goals that they're working towards. And it really is done as a co-creation. And then hopefully we haven't run over time and I have a chance to sum up properly with the student. And this is where I really do like to bring it all together into, as much as possible, half a page, few dot points, the real bones of the strategy or the tool that they're going to be attempting, so that we can give, we have a understanding of what we're doing. Some students do like this as like a pretty like dink, 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 a couple of checkpoints kind of things. Other students really do want a lot more detail. And I want to take this opportunity to help them put in place some ways to make sure that they have got some support for implementing the new plan, so that, are you getting an accountability buddy? Are you going to have it stack? Like, what's your sustainability? And I always like to follow up any appointment with a written summary of the discussion, the action plans, and the next steps as a really clear thing, just to support the students' ongoing process. It helps both me summarize and put together quite succinctly the appointment, the experience, and what we're trying to achieve. But again, for neurodivergent people, with the many myriad ways that we process information, offering them the capacity to access the written version after they process in the auditory version, the visual version, etc., is just another way to give them another support along the way. So hopefully I haven't gone too over time, and I can pass on to the next presenter.
Thank you. I think we got really good ideas from that presentation. So now we're going to move on to Rebecca Clarkson, who's also going to talk about successes and failures when working with one-on-one with students.
Thanks so much, Alex. Ugh, why does that happen? Okay, quick heads up. Jess, can you see the right screen? Am I presenting the right screen? I can see you there. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I am also going to share some thoughts from my own practice. There's a little bit of repetition. I'll try to avoid that as much as I can. Hopefully some of it's helpful, or at least will continue to spark this incredible conversation that's happening, in our community, is also in the chat. This quote is from an article in New York Magazine that I read recently from Mary Twee about her own experience of being diagnosed with autism as an adult. I share it because I love the reminder not to make assumptions about any individual learner, regardless of whether they've received a diagnosis or not, or whether they've disclosed a diagnosis or not within a one-on-one consult. So what I'm trying to do is to support every student towards self-awareness of the soulless system that is them, and then to support them to find ways to honour that in the context of learning. I often quote or adapt the quote from the writer George Saunders. I quote it all the time. He talks about everybody needing to have talent for their talent. So the goal is, it's another way of saying meta management. And it always comes back to this, whether we're talking about time management, executive functioning, working memory issues, perception of time. It's always about understanding who we are and how we're going to, have the best possible ways of working. So also, while the field is rapidly evolving, there's still a paucity of research. There's still stigma. What we know is changing really rapidly. I really liked something that a psychiatrist, Dr. Karen Saperto, said in a webinar from Attitude magazine, which I watch them regularly. She said that in her work as a psychiatrist, listening to lived experience is more important than reading books. And I hold that in these consultations. So what is working in the one-on-one consultations as I'm experiencing them? It's the things that we do already and bringing a real consciousness to them. So our work in one-on-one student appointments is radical in the way that we practice deep listening. And this might be about allowing consults to be cognitively flexible, non-linear, conceptually complex. All of that can still happen within the sort of framework that Kathy talked about. For some students, I note now I'm talking about, there are so many variables in a consult, as we all know. And so I'm talking about whether students disclose a diagnosis or not. So for some students, the appointment is more effective if I bring a consciousness to my energy, a heightened, focused energy. For others, as Kathy pointed out, I need to drop my voice, speak more slowly, and be really regulated, careful not to bring too many things in too quickly. These micro decisions and adjustments are made regardless of what I know about the student. I'm reading these cues. If I sense that a student may be sensitive to criticism, I'm slowing down even more. I'm lowering my expectations about what we're going to achieve in the consult. I tend to get quite excited about we're here, we get there. And I've got to really slow down myself. And I'll use negative politeness strategies if I think that there's a sensitivity there as well. Facilitating self-awareness and self-understanding. This is what we are all talking about. And I'll show some questions in the next slide that I will ask a student if I think that this is what needs to happen, that a student is not bringing an understanding and an honouring of who they are, their solar system, if you will. Also taking a strengths-based approach. This is so effective. What has happened before, what worked well, what were the conditions. As we know, students who are neurodivergent will have higher rates of learning difficulties and other issues. They're also therefore more likely to have learning trauma, which is why the affirmation, kindness and humour is so central to these one-on-one appointments, and understanding what's happening behind language. So recently a student said to me, I think I'm just incredibly lazy. I just think I'm really lazy. Now, I mean, it's what an incredibly self-aware and interesting thing to say, but what's happening behind that language? And we had this really great, funny conversation about what is lazy? What do you mean by lazy? How did you even get to this appointment today? And just sort of breaking down what's behind what she's feeling and thinking about herself. We also know that shame is a really big part of an experience of people who are neurodivergent through a result of all those traumas. They're coming to us at university level. There's a lot that's happened before they got here. So places to start. Tiana pointed out taking this sort of holistic approach. Now, I've put a whole lot of questions here. I've just sort of dumped them. The sorts of things that I'm asking students. I'm not asking all students all these questions. I'm guided by them. It might be an assignment-focused appointment, or it might be skills-based. With a neurodivergent student, it's always going to be skills-based as well as assignment-based, I find. So I'll ask about sleep. I'll talk about circadian rhythm. There's literally no point in setting your alarm to 6 a.m. if your body clock says no, mine says no. There's no virtue in getting up early and doing things early. It's about honouring who you are and the way you work. There's a misconception that we've talked about this. Kevin was putting some things in the chat there, I noticed. There's a misconception that digital apps and tech solutions are best. And certainly when I first started having students come to me and saying, you know, I have ADHD, and they said, just come and see you, I sort of thought, oh, you know, I need to know about all these apps so I can know which ones to suggest. They're often an analog approach, or a combination of analog and digital is appropriate. A lot of digital apps are deeply ironic for neurodivergent people. Did something start? So in terms of the analog strategies, a lot of post-it notes. It's amazing how often we come back to post-it notes. Mind mapping, hard copy, visual mnemonics are often favoured strategies. Did something work and then stop working is also a really good indicator that the student needs a strategy that's ever changing and that sparks interest in some other sort of way. I worked with a student recently where we worked out a lucky dip, where her courses, she would work on each of her 4 courses every day. She would pull from the lucky dip which one it would be. The thought of allocating a specific task to a time slot made her want to just run. And so we, found a creative way around that. So I need to remind myself not to jump in with strategies. The longer I can model myself calm and curious, and I genuinely am curious. I am really fascinated by this stuff, and I want to drill down to the moment where the student sort of looks up and goes, yeah, I don't like doing that. I do like it. Yeah, I can concentrate when that happens. And even just really obvious things like how much protein is required, how much hydration is needed, how we can, toggle things that are difficult to remember with something that is always remembered, as Kathy talked about. Often, this conversation, I think Tiana has touched on this at another time, students often haven't been asked these questions. And even students who come in with a diagnosis who have a psychologist or a psychiatrist haven't been asked these questions, which is mind-blowing to me. And sometimes just having this conversation is enough empowerment for that session. And then I might say, have a think about these things, reflect on them, come back and see me again or see another learning advisor, and we'll take it to the next step. So what's working? I really like this idea that while the outcome might be conventional, the process to get there doesn't have to be conventional. And I'm really interested in this idea of co-creating with the student. And I also love that often what we come up with, I haven't worked with another student in that way before. And so I'm surprised by that as well. Often students with learning trauma have a preconceived idea about what study skills should look like. So this idea of, university notes should look a certain way. And I like to remind students that those notes are for you. They're not for anybody else. They can look any way they need to look. A recent student told me that in the course of this back and forth that she knew Pitman's shorthand from another life, and she had never thought that she could use Pitman's shorthand in her note-taking at university. So that was step one. Okay, how can we change your note-taking from lectures to that? The other one was memory recall and preparing for exams. And she was saying, I just find it really hard to, externalize the memories, externalize the content, and come back to it in a way that will pique my interest. So in the course of unpacking that, she shared that she loves TED Talks. She loves the heightened intensity, the focus of a TED Talk. So this student is currently taking lecture notes in Pitman's shorthand. Every Friday, she sits down and creates a video of herself for her future self, TED Talk style, where she goes over that content that she can come back, and that's her preparation for exams. So I'm really keen to hear how that goes for her. It might be a disaster, or it might work for a bit and then not work. Totally open to it, and we'll have another discussion. And I've sort of, indicated that might be the case for her, so that there's no shame in coming back and saying, it was fun, but it didn't work in week 2. Excellent. Great self-awareness. Let's go again. The other thing with note-taking is one tip that's been working quite well is tying notes to emotional state or grounding them in the senses in another way. So an example of that might be writing at the top of the notes what you had for breakfast that morning, something about how you're feeling, something about what the lecturer is wearing, maybe give them a grade out of 10 for their fashion sense.
Hi, Rebecca. Sorry, if we could wrap up to have time for the next speaker.
Certainly. The notes are just for you. So what doesn't work? Making assumptions. One thing I want to share about that is my own prejudice around when students say they're bored about something. I would sort of think, well, we're all bored about things, but I understand what's happening behind that language now, and that's just come through my own sort of learning. We've talked about this. Be careful about recommending tools that cost money. Yeah, I think that's it. I've just put some resources that I find really useful and that have really helped me develop knowledge and come up with new ideas and tips, etc. Feel free to email me, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So we're going to move quickly to the last speaker. So it's Kevin Jones. We'll be talking about ADHD coaching at the University of Queensland. Kevin?
Move quickly. Okay. I actually have a student at 2 o'clock, so don't worry, I planned for this situation. I have flensed this down to its absolute bare minimums. Those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Kevin, Principal Learning Advisor at the University of Queensland, although we will not be called that sometime soon because we're going through the great renaming process of our jobs and our division. So check in again in a month and I'll tell you who I am and what I do. What I'm going to talk about now is our ADHD coaching trial at the University of Queensland, because we've kind of done the background over the last 4 sessions here, but I want to point out 2 things. One, supporting neurodivergent students. In fact, we don't like calling it support, but this is critical to widening participation at the university. It's crucial. So it's a thing that it's not negotiable anymore. It is a thing that has to happen. But I actually think there's a moral argument for this, that for us to achieve truly equitable learning, really, educational justice, we have to adapt to this if we haven't already. And that's something for like us as a community, us as a body. If the students aren't changing, we're the ones who have to adapt to this. And so it's something that if you haven't given it much thought before, particularly those of you, which is most of you learning advisors, that this is something that we simply, if you haven't trained in it before, have to train in. Because if we want to achieve like educational justice, that's the way. And that's what drove this ADHD coaching at UQ, because we were paralyzed sitting around going, we should probably do something about this, but we don't know what to do, because those of you who have gone into the literature will find that there's basically none. There is a handful of like tertiary adult ADHD learning research, let alone like supports that work. So everyone's stuck in this Ouroboros, this snake eating its own tail of like, when's the research going to come out so we know what to do? And therefore they're not doing anything to generate the research. So we made this call of like, well, let's just do something based on the evidence in the literature. And we went with ADHD group coaching. So this is going outside of one-on-one consults and thinking, all right, if we have one-on-one consults, which may or may not work, if we've got, what we call student access plans, may or may not work, you get an extension, doesn't actually really do anything. What is something else that we could recommend to a student that may actually do something? And that's where this ADHD, originally it's individualized coaching, but because we can't afford that, how do we make it affordable? Do a group thing. And so this process, I ran one today, just a few hours ago. It's me in a room. In that room, we have a bunch of mentors, volunteers, and based on some of the comments in the chat too, by the way, some are neurodivergent, some are neurotypical. It's often a mixture of psychology, social work students, but some are there simply to learn more about neurodivergence. Mentor sits at a table. Students, self-referred ADHD students come in. Well, I found out today that some of them are actually getting referred by our progression improvement policy process at UQ now, which is both gratifying and also scary. They sit down and we have a group coaching session where we run through some of the skills that we've talked about in the previous sessions. Today, for example, we focused on task initiation, so a common problem in neurodivergence. You sit down, you want to start an assignment, you do topic analysis, and you think of everything simultaneously. Every possible combination of what you could be doing this assignment, instantly overwhelmed, and you put it aside and you procrastinate on it because it's a rational response to something that is intensely painful. And so knowing that, you can't just say, oh, just sit down and do it. That doesn't work. Instead, it's looking at, well, what are some task initiation strategies? And that's what we brainstormed together today as a group, and students have gone away to try, knowing that it may work or it may not work. That's the real central core premise of this process is you try something knowing that there's a high chance it just simply won't work. Because a lot of ADHD management is experimentation to find out what works. There's a lot of you who will have sat opposite a student with ADHD in a consult, you will say something and they'll say, yeah, it doesn't work. I've tried it. Didn't work. And some of you have probably had those consults where literally over and over and over again, that's what happens. Well, what about this? Didn't work. What about this? It didn't work. And that's very common. And that brings me to what I want to be the most important takeaway point for my presentation. But if something you haven't thought about before as a learning advisor, you cannot separate the emotional and the cognitive in this space. They are intimately intertwined in neurodivergence. Like there's already stuff in the chat. I saw Jess was posting about this before, like the complex PTSD that particular adult diagnoses can bring with them. You cannot separate these. And so there's always this running joke in the LA space that we're kind of like psychologists who don't have psychological degrees. That is kind of what's happening here, is that you have to address the emotional dimension here for a lot of neurodivergence, because if you don't, that's actually the barrier. And so in some cases, that means like literal referrals, because you will find there's a degree of students who have to get some psychotherapeutic, potentially even pharmaceutical interventions here. But there is a huge space. Like I'd guess like probably 80% of students will actually benefit from like the cognitive stream, what we do, but it has to be tied up in emotions, feelings, because they just cannot be separated. And so some of the stuff people have talked about before in the previous presentations about just, essentially treating them like they're a person, talking to them. In fact, one of the best bits of takeaway advice is, you don't tell the students what to do. You ask them what has worked or not worked for them. And you start from there, because just imposing advice doesn't work. That's the whole thing. Like you never, ever say to an ADHD student, like, have you tried managing your time? It's a trigger, basically. Like, and it's almost never the case. The case is actually some other dimension, like meta management, that idea of like different layers of management that exist above the management you're trying. It's that. So if you're like, well, just do the Pomodoro technique and you'll be okay. Like, no. Like, it doesn't mean they can't use the Pomodoro technique. I've met plenty of students with ADHD who do find it useful and does work. Equally as many who are like, this is the worst thing in the world and I hate it. But they won't know unless they experiment. So you got to think if you're almost sort of like, what do they call them? Like an ayahuasca guide, where it's your job to kind of like take them through the process and look after them. One thing I want to give you is like really direct advice for the last 2 minutes here, by the way. Don't ask students who are neurodivergent to prioritize. As in just say like, oh, you just prioritize your tasks here. Often that's like impossible. Like it's a physical impossibility. You have to provide tools, structures, like ways. So the reason we brought up Goblin tools before is it's something that actually help you do that. As an external tool, we can be like, okay, well, you've got all these tasks here. You need to prioritize them. If you just say you need to prioritize them, that doesn't work. It's like, here's an actual mechanism that you can follow to do that. That's often what you have to look for in neurodivergent spaces, is when you dig down below like a particular level or above, there's something else there that you need to incorporate. I'm going to leave you on my favorite metaphor for all of this, which is you have to build a prosthetic brain, which I can't remember who actually said this, but it's this idea of like, you imagine like, if you lose an arm, for example, you have a prosthetic arm that you use, and you can think of a neurodivergence. It's sort of like building this extra prosthetic thing outside of your own head that is assisting. So in the case of like prioritization, if it's incapable of doing it, inside your own head, you have to have a system outside of it on paper. As Rebecca said, like digital analog, often you have to experiment in both those spaces to find out which one works. Because yeah, believe me, there is no consistency there about which one works. It's often doing the one that they haven't been doing previously, because they'll have conditioned themselves or traumatized themselves so badly by the previous system that they'll have a lot of like liberty in the other system. But I really love this metaphor of like prosthetic brains, this idea of you've got to get this stuff out of your head and do it externally. Now we have exactly 1 minute until 2 o'clock. So you want to do 30 seconds of questions?
I don't think we have time for that. I mean, it's been so wonderful. We could have one session with each of you to have all the questions. But thank you all for this very inspiring, and I think it left us all eager to learn more, and hopefully we'll find a space where we can do this. But thank you all, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time. I'll be in contact with all of you. Thank you.
And we'll share all this stuff, obviously.
Yeah, so you can maybe send it to me and I'll put it together. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.